Thank you, everyone. I am the son of immigrants. My father was a chemical engineer, and when I was 7 years old, he uprooted our family, and we moved from Seoul, South Korea, to a small college town, Norman, Oklahoma. I'm still a diehard Sooner fan, Boomer Sooner. I can't say my childhood was easy all the time. There were hardships that we faced, but I have so many fond memories about Oklahoma. And Oklahoma will always be a part of my home and my heart. One of the memories that gets funnier as I get older, and it's pertinent to the talk today, is about music and adolescence. You see, when I was growing up in the 80s, we were all into like heavy metal and hair metal, and I know many of you were too. Your kids probably have pictorial proof. Anyway, my parents were convinced with their parents that that music was from the devil, okay? And so they told us not to listen to that music. They were very concerned about all the changes we were undergoing as adolescents. And so they told us two conspiracy theories. The first was that the acronym for whatever band we listened to stood for something about the devil. My favorite, though, was actually putting the vinyl record on the turntable and playing it backwards, because then you get a personalized message straight from Satan. And I laugh about this now, but some of that laughter is kind of like a ha-ha fearful laughter, because as my kids grow up, and they're not teenagers yet, I'm afraid that I'll be out of touch as a parent when they become teenagers. I now have a privilege. I have a great privilege in helping families from across the country. And I have parents who come to me asking for help. And they have teenagers that are undergoing many changes and hardships. And we know what all the pitfalls are for adolescents in our country. Suicide, cyberbullying, the list goes on. And addiction is on that list as well. So there might be an example of a young person who starts to not go to class so much, and their friends change, and their hairstyles change, and the way they talk change. And they become less interested in school activities, and they start skateboarding a lot, and they spend more time at the skate park than they do on their school activities, and the parents get concerned, and they want to say something about the skateboarding, but in their minds, in the back of their minds, they have the same memories that I have of my parents, and we don't want to be out of tune. We don't want to be uncool. So there's something that's awkward about the activity, but we don't say anything. Actually, it turns out there's a little bit of truth in their intuition. Not in the way they're looking at it, but their intuition is partially correct, and here's how. In the 80s, we learned a lot about drugs incorrectly by watching after-school special. These after-school specials always had some guy with sunglasses and a leather jacket straight from a Michael Jackson video. And he was handing out drugs like this. And there's always two lines, which is, don't you want to be cool? And everybody's doing it. Well, now we know better. Now we know that kids actually start using substances not because of peer pressure. A lot of kids actually start to self-select. So the science says that it's more like birds of the same feather flock together. High-risk kids gravitate towards each other in middle school and early high school, and they matriculate to using substances together. To get back to skateboarding, what's really happening is the parents are concerned about the activity. But skateboarding is relatively harmless. Skateboarding is fine. What's actually happening, though, is that these activities form subcultures. And these subcultures lend to certain permissive beliefs that might be more permissive about substance use. And if you happen to have a young person who's at risk for substance use disorders and they get into this cohort in a subculture, now you have a problem. So you see, their intuition wasn't completely off base. They just had the wrong lens. They were looking at it the wrong way. In fact, when we think about addiction in general, our infrastructure to handle addiction simply can't solve our problems because we're looking at things through the wrong perspective. Let me take a step back a little bit and give you a little example of how powerful perspective is. So I see a lot of kids, and some kids I see are very angry that day. They're angry at their moms, they're angry at their boyfriends, they're angry at the police, they're angry at their school principals, they're angry, and they're coming in, and they cool down a little bit, and I show them this picture. And it's pixelated on purpose, and they don't know what it is, and I say, if your friends text message you a picture of that place, would you go hang out? And they're like, what is that, a blue door on a blob? Of course they don't want to go. And then I zoom out a little bit, and I show them this. They say, oh, it's a trash can on a beach. Then we go around pointing some details around the beach, like the lifeguard house and the volleyball net and the people who are enjoying the weather. And I zoom out even further, and their perspective starts to change. They get a smile on their face, and I ask them a rhetorical question. If your friends asked you to hang out in this place, would you go? And of course they say yes. But the next question is more important. I ask, what happened to that trash can? And intuitively they say, it got smaller. But it didn't. The trash can is the same size. It smells just as bad as it did before. We just switched our lens. We just looked at the right perspective. All the people on the beach are not in denial of the trash can being there. When they get done with snacks, hopefully they'll be responsible citizens and throw it away in the right place. But they're having the right perspective, which allows them to enjoy their time on the beach. Nobody goes to the beach, complains about a trash can, sits closer to it, complains about it more, and then leaves. But we have the wrong perspective with addiction. So let's drive this home further with two examples. I'm going to take us back to Norman, Oklahoma, Boomer Sooner. And imagine two boys. They're fraternal twin brothers, 14 years old. And on one school day, Eric and Anthony, these two brothers, are doing different activities. Eric is seeing his primary care doctor. And his primary care doctor, she's sharp as a whip. And she knows that Eric is 70 pounds overweight. She knows that the only vegetable in Eric's diet is ketchup. She knows that Eric doesn't exercise and plays video games too much. She knows that there's a family history of heart disease and metabolic syndrome, so she intervenes. Eric hasn't had any symptoms yet. He doesn't qualify for any diagnoses yet, but she intervenes. There's a dietitian and follow-up labs and visits and talking to parents. There's a plan and a strategy, and that's how we should treat chronic illnesses, right? His brother Anthony, the same day, is caught behind the school smoking something with a few of his friends. He gets suspended for a few days. He won't cop to exactly what it was. The school says you have to get cleared by a counselor or a therapist before you come back. And what the school officials know and the counselors know fairly easily is that Anthony has a family history loaded with addiction. They know that his school grades have been dropping slightly, and he's never been a great student. He's never been that diligent. He's had some behavior problems all throughout. He has ADHD. Friends are changing around. The science tells us that all of these things are actually potential risk factors for addiction, in as much as obesity is for metabolic syndrome. But while Eric gets early intervention, Anthony sees a well-meaning therapist, and they have conversations with people about whether this is just a phase. And he gets sent back to school. And 3 years later, 5 years later, I see these Anthonys in my office. And the train has come off its wheels, and the families are desperate. And a lot of harm has been done, and I have to ask myself, couldn't we have done more? Shouldn't we have done more? And the answer is yes. So what is the right perspective to have on addiction? Well, there's two things that we have to consider. The first perspective is this. Addiction is a developmental disorder. This is not a bias. This is not a semantic. These are just the facts. On this graph, you see when people actually develop problematic substance use disorders, and you see that they develop them sometime between the ages of 15 and 25. That's when most people actually show problematic symptoms of addiction. If this were any other chronic illness that was preventable, like a preventable cancer or a preventable metabolic syndrome, you would deploy all your resources, or as many as you could, before the peak of that graph, wouldn't you, to prevent problems? What do we do in addiction? We wait until decades after the problem starts. And then we use a model that is not developmentally sensitive. It's a backward system, and that's the perspective we have to change. The second perspective takes a little explaining to do, and it's called the common liability theory. Sounds like a fancy term, but it's actually fairly straightforward. Common liability theory says that there are shared liabilities and risk factors that we accumulate through our lives. Some of it is genetic. And these shared liabilities lead to a number of pathologies upstream or downstream, not just one. So to use a concrete example and going back to obesity, if somebody has obesity, that's a risk factor not only for heart disease, that's also a risk factor for diabetes. And it's a risk factor for back pain, it's a risk factor for sleep apnea, and all sorts of other problems down the road. It's a shared liability that accumulates. And believe it or not, addiction is the same. We have this cliched notion that addiction is more about drugs than people. So we keep talking about drugs, and we assume kids are pure, and they use drugs, and they get addicted, and once you remove the drugs, they're pure again, and that's not true. That would be like people having heart attacks without any risk factors. It happens, but not very often. The right perspective is the common liability theory, and if you track that backwards, without doing fancy brain imaging or tests, using simple questionnaires, you can actually pick out the highest risk kids when they're 10 years old, years before they touch any substance at all. Imagine if we could intervene then. Imagine if we could help some families at that juncture. By the time kids start using substances, it's already an uphill battle. Friends are set in, attitudes are set in, their social cliques are set in, their belief systems are set in. Our best screening tools wait until substance use occurs, and then we sort them into mild, medium, or spicy substance use disorder, and we act then. It's kind of like waiting for people to have a heart attack and then diagnosing heart disease. It's backwards. Consider some other perspectives. When we Diagnose 10-year-olds with ADHD. Do we ask any questions about family history of addiction, even though we feel that might be a risk factor? When kids are sent to the principal's office in the 5th grade, do we think about their risk and trajectory at all? We don't. And there are gaps in the system because of it. The worst offense is when kids have behavior problems in school, what we do is the science says that they flock together, they congregate together, and they matriculate together to more trouble and drugs. So what do we do when behavior problems arise in school? We take these kids, collect them, and accelerate it by pulling them together in alternative learning centers. We do the exact opposite of what the science tells us to do. And that's what we have to change if we want to make a difference. But there is hope. Prevention dollars are well spent. The government says that every dollar we spend on prevention, we get $2 to $10 back. It's not going to work for everybody, but it will definitely help. It will make a huge impact on families and communities, and it will change the dialogue. Hopefully by now, many of you are chomping at the bit. You want to know more. What are the details? What's the manual? What's the therapeutic clinical practice? What are the skills and the magic words we say to kids? And I'm just going to ask you to pause for a second. I'm going to ask you to pause because there's one more obstacle that we have to face, and that's in our perspective. That's in our hurts. And the obstacle is actually this guy. This guy is a hipster. I did my best rendition in a drawing. But I'm not actually here to talk about hipsters. I'm here to talk about the spirit of hipsterism. So I'm not here to talk about craft brews or people buying clothes from the Goodwill unnecessarily. I'm actually here to talk about the spirit of hipsterism. The spirit of hipsterism is not really knowing something fully, not understanding something fully, not being humble enough to really study it, but knowing enough on the surface to pass like you do. Right? Well, here's the unfortunate news. All of us are hipsters. All of us have been infected by the spirit of hipsterism. You want proof? All of us wake up in the morning, read a couple of tweets and a Facebook article, and we think we know what's going on in the Middle East. We think we know healthcare better than anybody else. We can fix the economy. We can pinpoint all the problems so clearly because we read it in the New York Times. And it's the wrong attitude. And what you've actually seen is a divisive society because hipsterism isn't about echo chambers and fake news. It's really about the intersection of open source information and human nature. You see, it's an old human adage that the more correct we think we are, the more righteous we think we are, the less need we have to be empathetic towards others. It actually goes in proportion, and it's just human nature. So what happens is polarizing discussions about every kind of social issue that you can imagine. And it happens in front of your face, it happens in the news, it happens in social discourse, and addiction is no exception. We don't take the deep dive. We have superficial conversations about magic words and tactics. We talk more about drugs than we do about people. We've established that addiction is really about people. People get addicted to drugs and alcohol, but addiction is about people. Addiction is about communities. Addiction is about families. And we spend all our time talking about which drug and which drug is better than this drug, and how about this drug to treat that drug. All important conversations, but we need to center the focus around people. Because under a hipster paradigm, things like prevention, trees that you plant that don't bear fruit right away, that take a little while, maybe a generation to really yield dividends, those aren't as sexy, right? They don't draw the attention of people. But those are exactly the kinds of investments that we need to make. So you might want to ask, what's the solution to hipsterism? What do we do with that? And the knee-jerk reaction, of course, is the opposite of that self-righteousness. It's empathy. It's empathic perspective. But I'm going to pause one more time because empathy as a standalone jargon has actually come under the corruption of hipsterism. Because many of you have heard the term. People talk about it all the time. Revolutionary talks, books have been written. We all talk about empathy, but we're missing the point in it, and it's not changing our social discourse. And that's because we're forgetting two values that actually go with empathy. The first is humility, and the second is grace. And I'm here to argue that you can't have one without the other two. You cannot empathize and walk through life through somebody else's lens if you aren't humble. If you think you're a magical unicorn or a magical snowflake or different than other people, how can you possibly empathize fully? Secondly, once you start to empathize with people regularly, you see that we are all human. You see that if we live by the sword, we die by the sword. And you see the spirit of redemption leaving our social discourse when we have polarizing conversations. We see the need for grace as much as we see the need for empathy. And the recovery from addiction is all about grace. It's all about redemption. And if we lose that spirit of redemption in our society, what does that say about us? To close things up, it comes around to what I tell parents, because I tell them the same thing. They ask me to deconstruct these prevention programs. What do I say to my kid, right? And they ask me, can my kid have a glass of wine at Thanksgiving dinner? The wrong questions, but I tell them, you got to improve communication, your relationship with them is a protective factor, but I'm also very explicit. I say, teach your kids humility. Model humility. Teach your kids how to be gracious. Model grace. Teach your kids how to be empathetic. Model empathy. If we infuse that spiritual perspective into the scientific strategy, now we have a discussion that is soulful and meaningful, that makes sense in science and in our hearts. And if we can do that, we can finally start to stem the tide of addiction before it starts. Thank you.